Hello, this is Paul Saunders. Welcome to another edition of the Three Questions podcast. For those of you who might have listened more than once before this is one of those episodes today where I'm just kind of talking myself, giving you a long monologue about some of the things that I think about or think are important. I guess it's kind of up to all of you to decide whether any of it actually is important. But I wanted to talk today a little bit about the national interest. And here I mean not the Center for the National Interest or our publication, The National Interest, but actually national interests of the United States of America, which for me and I think for many others are kind of an animating concern as we think about America and our role in the world. And I thought I would talk in particular about a project that we did 30 years ago at around this very time, which was called the Commission on America's National Interests. And this was a bipartisan group of fairly distinguished people. I won't read the list. It was about 15 or 20 people, and anyone who wants to see who was in the group, I'd certainly encourage you to look up the report at the Center for the National Interest website, which is cftni.org. And if you go there to the site and sort of burrow into the publications and reports, you can find the report there. The commission was something that we did together with the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University, and also with RAND, which many may know is a big think tank, and it's a special kind of think tank called a federally funded research and development center, which means that they do much of their work in response to government contracts. In any event, we kind of got together with these other institutions. We put together this group of people. We had meetings to talk about, what actually are America's national interests? And we did this in, again, 1996, which I guess I would remind everyone, was relatively early in the period after the end of the Cold War, and a time when, not unlike today, albeit for different reasons, many of us felt that Americans were a little bit confused about the world that we were living in and, what the United States can and should do. And we got together this group to try to think through that question and to come up with some good answers. And I would say more than that, not just to come up with a list of national interests, because, anybody can come up with a list of national interests. There are a lot of things that the United States is affected by around the world, or things that, we might want to change. The problem is if you make a list of 30 or 40 of those things and you call them all national interests, then pretty soon you find that you have kind of a long list of mutually contradictory things, that it's not realistic for the United States to try to do so many things at the same time. So what's really important is not kind of making a long list of interests, but actually trying to come up with some sort of system to prioritize them. And in most political systems, and certainly in democratic political systems, we're kind of often looking to our leaders to establish those kinds of priorities. And in democracies, at least, we get to choose our leaders in part based on what they think our priorities should be, because we have kind of similar views of priorities. That was really the aim of the effort, ultimately, was to try to think through some kind of a hierarchy. And in certain respects, it was kind of a reaction against a trend at the time, which was for, everybody who wanted the United States to do something somewhere in the world to describe it as vital to American national interests to do this or to do that. Many in the group felt that this word vital had been used so frequently that it kind of stopped meaning, what vital really means. If you look it up in the dictionary, something essential to survival. We came up as a group with a definition for what we thought vital should mean. And then we came up with a couple of other categories, extremely important and important, to create a hierarchy of interests that, maybe really matter, but aren't strictly vital, or maybe, are important, but aren't sort of super important. As a group, we distilled this down to the definition of vital, down to a phrase that I'm going to read here because I think it's valuable as a tool for thinking about national interests. And different people can have their definition, so I'm not going to sort of stand and die for every word of this definition. But I think it's a great tool for thinking. And the definition that we published in the report is: vital national interests are conditions that are strictly necessary to safeguard and enhance the well-being of Americans in a free and secure nation. So there are a few parts of that sentence that are important. One, we use this phrase vital national interest because we're trying to define it. Secondly, there's this part, strictly necessary. Strictly necessary. And that's where we're trying to get at the dictionary definition of what vital is really supposed to mean. These are things that are essential for America to continue as a free and secure nation, and for Americans to have good lives in a country like that. One of the really terrific accomplishments here, I think, was to distill down all of the things that one could think of as American interests into just 5 specific vital national interests. And a lot of thought went into this at the time. And I think these actually have held up quite well. You listen and be the judge. First, prevent, deter, and reduce the threat of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons attacks on the United States. I think that's a good one where it's fairly clear why that's a vital interest. If you have a nuclear attack on the United States, by the way, even one nuclear weapon detonating somewhere in the United States, or, certainly a biological agent being released in the United States, that's going to really change immediately our way of life. Certainly from my point of view, something that's vital. Secondly, prevent the emergence of a hostile hegemon in Europe or Asia. And here we have kind of the idea that there is a hostile power dominating Europe or dominating Asia would potentially create a vital danger to the United States. Particularly for foreign policy realists, you would kind of start thinking down the pathway that, if there's a hostile power that controls one of these two regions and controls all of its resources and is able to use those, then that hegemon, would have very considerable power and could be really a grave threat to America. And, we don't want to live in a world where that's the case. And if you look back at cases like World War II, for example, that's a case where arguably, the United States intervened in Europe to try to prevent the emergence of a potentially hostile hegemon. I know, some people will listen and want to have a debate about that. Go to it. But I think there are good reasons to think about the conflict in those terms. World War II in Asia was a little bit different, of course, because the United States was attacked, which creates a somewhat different picture. But the attack was, I think, arguably the result of American policies, economic sanctions in particular, against Imperial Japan in order to try to prevent Imperial Japan from becoming a hostile hegemon. And of course, Japan at the time had forces in China and was moving toward Indochina. Third vital interest, prevent the emergence of a hostile major power on U.S. borders or in control of the seas. Those are other cases where if we had a hostile major power on our borders, that would clearly pose a significant threat to the United States and force us to orient a lot of resources toward that threat in ways that would kind of undercut American well-being and security. And control of the seas also, as many recognize, a big component of American security actually is the fact that we're actually quite remote from most countries that could really threaten us. Control of the seas could change that. So having a hostile power in control of the seas, which is not the same as the United States trying to control the seas, but having a hostile power in control of the seas could also be threatening. Fourthly, prevent the collapse of major global systems, trade, financial markets, energy supplies, global environmental systems, certainly to include kind of catastrophic climate change. And again, catastrophic climate change. We're talking about catastrophic collapse of major global systems, a vital interest there. And then finally, ensure the survival of U.S. allies as a vital interest. And that's a kind of an interesting one in many respects for people who like to parse language, ensure the survival of U.S. allies. The group did not say ensure the territorial integrity of U.S. allies, which is something that many might have included in a formulation like that. But I think the view of the group was that, it's vital for the United States to continue to have allies who add their capabilities to our own and allow us to achieve our objectives internationally to protect the United States. It's not necessarily vital to America that each ally, maintains control over every square kilometer of its territory. I thought that was kind of an interesting and in some respects courageous choice. There are 11 extremely important interests that are kind of subsidiary to the vital interests. Extremely important being defined as national interests that, if compromised, would severely prejudice but not strictly imperil the ability of the U.S. government to safeguard and enhance the well-being of Americans in a free and secure nation. So that's kind of a step down. I'm not going to read all 11 of those. Walking through 11 of them is a little bit much, but I will just mention a few that might be timely and interesting. One was prevent the emergence of a regional hegemon in important regions such as the Persian Gulf. Another was protect U.S. friends and allies from significant external aggression. Another was prevent massive uncontrolled immigration across U.S. borders. And, again, there were 11. That's just 3 of them. If you're interested, please go to www.cftni.org and look up the whole report, and you can see some of the others. Then finally, we had this third category of just important. And just important national interests are conditions that, if compromised, would have major negative consequences for the ability of the U.S. government to safeguard and enhance the well-being of Americans in a free and secure nation. So major negative consequences is, again, kind of a step down from severely prejudice, and severely prejudice is itself a step down from strictly necessary. Some of the important interests that we identified for the United States, and again, there are like 10 of these. I'm not going to try to go through all of them. I'm just going to list a few that might be interesting for people in the context of some of our recent and current debates. Promote pluralism, freedom, and democracy in strategically important states as much as is feasible without destabilization. Prevent and, if possible, at low cost, end conflicts in strategically insignificant geographic regions, protect the lives and well-being of American citizens who are targeted or taken hostage by terrorist organizations, boost the domestic output of key strategic industries and sectors where market imperfections may make deliberate industrial policy rational. And then, there are a number of other things. Again, I thought was most interesting and important about this whole exercise is trying to define and think through priorities. And I think this is, again, 30 years later, one of the big challenges we're having today, because we had sort of a consensus on what our priorities should be on a bipartisan basis. And, not all of us agreed with that consensus, but we sort of had a consensus during the 1990s, the 2000s, and midway through the 2010s. But at that point, the consensus really broke down. And I don't think that the United States has yet established a new consensus, which I certainly hope we can do before too much longer, because at least personally, I think it's important to have some degree of foreign policy consensus for the United States to be able to do the things that we need to do as a country. That's just a very quick overview of this report, which is called American National Interests and is, again, a publication of the Commission on America's National Interests. I'd encourage, again, anyone interested to go look at it, or at least to think a little bit about some of these questions and about what you think is personally is kind of more important or less important, and how you might, in your own thinking about our national interests, try to come up with a systematic set of priorities. The other kind of really big question in thinking about our national interest, separate from the two questions that I addressed already, what are they and how do we kind of rank them? There's kind of a really big third question, which is who gets to decide? Are our national interests something that are kind of an objective reality that we just have to discover or acknowledge and live with? Is it something that we kind of decide as a country? If it's something we decide in a country, who decides? And I guess, my own view would be that there's kind of an objective element to it, but there's also a big subjective element to it. Objectively, I would certainly argue that there are some things out there in the world that, if we ignore them, we stop having a country. And if we stop having a country, clearly our national interests at that point have been fatally undermined. So there are certainly some security threats out there. And I think this America's National Interests report pointed toward a couple of the most significant ones, like nuclear weapons or having kind of a reflexively hostile power, that kind of rivals our own capabilities. Those are some pretty serious things that we need to think about pretty carefully. But there are also elements that can be, more subjective. In some cases, they can be subjective and kind of defined by leaders, and leaders try to bring public opinion along with how they define national interests. In other cases, there may be sort of bottom-up pressure, especially, but not only in democracies, from citizens who want their leaders to define interests differently than how they are. Certainly in our own society, I think we've seen a lot of both of these dynamics over the last 10 to 15 years, actually really over the last 20 years, dating from when people started to really question the U.S. intervention in Iraq, and the Bush administration had to defend that. Certainly, I think that conflict had a major role in the 2008 election outcome, too. But this question of who decides very much also a core element in thinking about what our national interests are, and certainly people who want to see them defined differently than how leaders might define them should be out there making every possible effort to promote and win support for their own points of view. So I hope this might have been an interesting conversation, or I guess more appropriately, monologue on my part. I certainly invite conversation for anyone who wants to send in ideas or comments. I do feel that the report that I mentioned was a very important one, and I'm kind of routinely actually surprised when I bring it up to learn how many people may have seen it in a college class or alternatively adopted it as part of a college curriculum. I do think it had a fair amount of impact in terms of how people think about U.S. national interests. And I hope it'll have more because, as I've tried to say today, despite being a 30-year-old project, I think it's still really as relevant in 2026 as it was in 1996. So with that, I'll wrap up for today. Thank you again for listening in to the latest episode of 3 Questions. I hope it may have been interesting. This is Paul Saunders with the Center for the National Interest, signing off.